Estuary English is the variety of English spoken popularly in this part of England, and it's therefore appropriate that you should know something about it. First of all, then, a few words about the dialect and accent situation in England in general. In some country areas, people speak traditional dialect, which differs from standard English in many, many different ways. However, with increasing urbanization over the last 2 centuries, and with the increased ease of travel and influence of the capital city, influence of education, traditional dialects have gone into very sharp decline. So there are not many parts of England, for example, where the second person singular pronoun thou is still in use, although there are some. Indeed, I had a great aunt who, when I was a small child, would address me as thou rather than you, and say things like, wouldst like a cup of tea? Meaning, would you like, wouldst thou like, wouldst like. That's traditional dialect. That's virtually disappeared from England, certainly from the south. Nevertheless, we still have local forms of speech that differ in many ways from the standard that you are taught in textbooks and which is recorded in dictionaries. In particular, many grammatical features differ in popular English from the standard form that we learn and read and write. Cockney is the name given to London working class speech, which, amongst other things, typically has these non-standard grammatical features. We shall look at some of them in just a moment. Nevertheless, it's very helpful when talking about English, certainly in the British Isles, to make a distinction between dialect and accent, where dialect refers to matters such as grammar, vocabulary, usage in the general sense, but accent refers only to pronunciation. And in that sense, we can helpfully say that standard English can be spoken with a number of different accents. I mean, at the most obvious level, from your point of view, I can speak standard English with an American accent or with a British accent. And the differences as far as grammar, as far as vocabulary are concerned, are negligible, but the differences in pronunciation are noticeable. So now when talking about London English, we have to ask ourselves, is this just a matter of accent, or is it more generally a matter of dialect? Well, it may be one or it may be both. Educated people are able to use and operate in standard English. That's one of the marks of education. It's one of the things that you are taught when you become educated. Nevertheless, many people from, shall we say, a southeastern working class background go through secondary education, enter higher education, get university degrees, get university posts, and still retain a quite noticeable degree of southeastern pronunciation. So that there are many university teachers in the University of London whose speech is noticeably southeastern, even though they are educated people and using standard English. And the question is then, how do we describe their speech? And one expression that has come into use recently to refer to this form of speech is this term estuary English. Now, an estuary is a wide river mouth. And the estuary we're talking about is, of course, the Thames estuary, the wide mouth of the River Thames. London is on the River Thames. As we go eastwards from London, the river widens. As you know, after London Bridge, there are no more bridges, but there are tunnels. And ultimately, there's then a very high bridge to take the motorway, and that's the end. That's as the river gets wider and wider. Londoners have, of course, settled in all of these surrounding areas, so that we can't say that London's speech is restricted really to London. All of the southeast of England, as far as the towns are concerned, sounds similar to London. And that's why this term Estuary English was coined, so as to get across the idea that it's not just London, but the whole of the Thames Estuary region. There is an extremely unscientific map, which, as you can see, suggests that the influence of London spreads out into the surrounding areas, so that Estuary English, Thames Estuary English, characterises not only London, but also areas as far away as Norwich or parts of Wessex. That map comes from a popular book, Do You Speak Estuary? There's a picture of its colour. You can perhaps see it here in colour. I think it's now sold out already, but it's appeared 2 or 3 years ago, 1994 in fact, by Paul Coggle, or rather his name is not Coggle, but Coggle. Coggle. And his name, in fact, exemplifies one of the characteristics of estuary pronunciation, namely that dark L changes into a vowel sound. So rather than Coggle, his name is Coggle, Coggle, at the end. Do you speak estuary? The new standard English, how to spot it and speak it. Now there's an interesting claim. The claim is that, well, because the influence of the capital city is so great, that estuary English is due to become the new standard English, implicitly therefore displacing the pronunciation standard of received pronunciation. On the other hand, the artist illustrating this has shown some very interesting features which make one ask really whether we're talking about a different standard or something quite different. You've got two figures there. On the left, there's a gentleman, an older man, wearing a bowler hat, carrying an old-fashioned telephone, and saying, "Please telephone at your convenience, Terence." On the right, on the other hand, there's a younger man carrying a mobile phone, a little bit clunky by modern-day standards. That just shows you how rapidly they've evolved in the past 5 years. Anyhow, he's obviously much younger and trendier, and he says, "Give us a bell tell." Clearly, the first one, as you see the labels, the first one is meant to exemplify Oxford English, the second one to exemplify Estuary English. People often ask me, what is Oxford English? And I have to tell them it's an expression used really only by people overseas, and it's more or less disappeared from use in England, but it's an old expression meaning standard English, Queen's English, and implicitly spoken with received pronunciation. It's not anything especially localized to Oxford, but it refers to Oxford as the site of Oxford University and therefore standards in such matters. My problem is this, that as a native speaker of English, in fact, I have within my repertoire both usages of the form, "Please telephone at your convenience," and usages of the form, "Give us a bell," or "Give us a ring." And I would argue that these two forms are different styles of speech which are available within the same standard English, or whatever we like to call it. And furthermore, both can certainly be pronounced in received pronunciation, just as both can be pronounced with a local London accent. So I feel this is painting a false dichotomy, as if people fell into different categories according to which form of English they use, when the reality is that most people have a range of styles which covers at least these two and many others. In discussing matters of accent and usage in general in English, we can't escape from the fact of social class. In England, much more so than in other English-speaking places, there are fairly sharp differences of usage depending on people's social class. Which is to say that working class accents, grammar, differ from one another very much more than do middle class, upper class accents and grammar. Received pronunciation essentially is an upper class pronunciation, upper plus upper middle class. And it reflects the fact that historically they were the only classes that underwent education, and that the people who could read and write 200 years ago, even 150 years ago, were essentially the upper class people. Well, things are very different nowadays, of course. Nevertheless, it remains the fact that our norms, our standards, as in most European countries, are ultimately class-based. But with the wide spread of education, so that people of all social classes now have the opportunity for extensive education, it means that we can't make the simple claims about them that we once used to. Nevertheless, the sociolinguists have demonstrated, and it's anyhow well known, that depending on your social class origins and your social class aspirations, your language will differ. And generally speaking, the further down the social scale you are, the more you have local features in your pronunciation, and features that are local differ by definition from those that are standard, because one of the characteristics of standard language, and indeed in Britain, in England, of standard received pronunciation, one of the characteristics is that they're not localizable. To the extent that I'm using received pronunciation, you can't, as an English speaker, say whether I come from the north of England, the south of England, the east or the west. There is nothing in my speech to tell you that. I don't have a London accent, I don't have a Cambridge accent, I don't have an Oxford accent, I don't have a Manchester accent. On the other hand, if I were to speak in a working class way, with a local accent of one of those places, you would recognize it as such, and it would tell you which place it was. A working class accent is localizable. It's London, or it's Manchester, or it's Edinburgh, or it's Exeter. But that's painting a false picture too, because it suggests we've got two extremes. We've got either RP Standard English, non-localizable, or a whole mass of local accents, working class localizable. The fact of the matter is that most people don't occupy either of those extremes of the scale, but some intermediate point. Most people's pronunciation is not a broad local accent, nor is it exactly received pronunciation as described in the books, but it's somewhere between those two extremes. And the problem is then very largely one of delimiting our categories. Any particular entity we want to set up for descriptive purposes immediately faces us with the difficulty of saying, well, where do we draw the line? How far does it go? This is an impossible problem to answer. People say, now, does so-and-so speak with received pronunciation? It all depends how you define it. If you define it very narrowly, perhaps no. If you define it rather more broadly, then yes. And there's no obviously correct way to define such matters. So we've got this continuum. I think the most helpful definition of estuary English is to say that it's standard English, but spoken with a southeastern accent. Cockney, on the other hand, is non-standard English, spoken with a southeastern accent. That's at least a kind of working definition that we can use to work towards understanding how these expressions are used. The fact of the matter is that they are not terms invented by linguists, or by phoneticians, or by sociologists. They're popular terms from journalism. They're the kinds of expressions that newspapers use in the assumption that everybody will understand them, but without feeling the need to define them in the way that an academic would do. Paul Cockle, therefore, very sensibly illustrates his book by referring to individual people who are well known in Britain. You may or may not know these people. They're people who appear on television. And so you've got two examples of received pronunciation there. Brian Sewell, who's the art critic of the Evening Standard, and Joanna Lumley, a well-known actress in Absolutely Fabulous. Some of you may have seen that. They're good examples of perhaps a rather marked variety of received pronunciation. On the other extreme, we've got for Cockney there, Pauline Quirk, who was in a television series called Birds of a Feather. I don't know if any of you know that. Two Cockney sisters. And the other example of Cockney, interestingly enough, is the son of a West Indian immigrant, namely Frank Bruno, the boxer, who, having been born and brought up in London, certainly speaks London English and is in fact a very good example of Cockney. Has all of the features that we associate with Cockney. In between, we've got this category of estuary. They're all television presenters of one kind and another. Michael Caine, the film star, Jonathan Ross, television presenter, Bob Hoskins, another film star, and Janet Street Porter, television producer and director and manager and so on. And all of them speak, yes, standard English, but with quite noticeable London features in their pronunciation. Well, now, what are the actual linguistic characteristics of some of these things? Back to Coggle's book. He gives examples of different ways of saying the same thing, teaching you how to speak estuary. And you see the first example, a friend asks for a loan of £100. You refuse. What do you say? Do you say, I'm frightfully sorry, but that's just not on? Do you say, I'm afraid I can't, sorry? Do you say, sorry, no? Do you say, no can do? Or do you say, no way? Well, if I ask myself that question, again, I have to tell you that I could say any of those 5 things. Those are all within my repertoire. No can do is a funny expression. It's sort of imitation pidgin English, probably originating in Hong Kong, reflecting Chinese grammar, but somehow becoming well known and being an option. We have a slang where we have a saying we can't do something. We say no can do. No way has come in more recently, of course, from the United States. I don't think that reflects any difference between standard English or Oxford English and estuary English at all. I would claim they're all perfectly possible within standard English. Nobody has ever accused me of speaking estuary English. Well, the rest are really more examples of the same sort of thing, but you might find them helpful to look at. If we're explaining a football team's poor performance, what do we say? Essentially, they lack the prerequisites of success. Do we say, actually, they haven't got what it takes? Do we say, in a nutshell, they haven't got a clue? Do we say, basically, they're rubbish? Or do we say, basically, they're rubbish, know what I mean? Now, this, do you know what I mean, or know what I mean, is a kind of trademark of Frank Bruno. Do you remember you saw Frank Bruno as one of the examples of Cockney, the boxer? And he's notorious for ending every comment with, know what I mean? And indeed, it's a common thing people do in London. Since I've said these aloud to you, I've had to say them aloud in one way or another. And that, of course, in a sense, means that I have to come down, I have to make decisions. I said them all to you in received pronunciation, but I could equally have said, essentially, they lack the prerequisites of success. That might have been more estuary English. Actually, they haven't got what it takes. Now, haven't there is standard grammar, so that is an important choice. If I'm going to speak estuary English, they haven't got. If I'm going to speak Cockney, it would switch to they ain't got, with ain't instead of haven't. Similarly with the next one, in a nutshell, they haven't got a clue. As long as you use haven't, that's standard English. Number 8 is an example of vocabulary differences. Where do you go when you need to do certain actions? Visiting friends in their new house, do you ask where's the lavatory? Do you ask where's the bathroom? Do you ask where's the loo? Do you ask where's the toilet? Or do you say where's the kazi? Or do you say, I wonder if you could show me the geography of the house? Well, there are various options. These names for that facility, again, are a thing that people often discuss because they vary from one class to another, from one background to another. Lavatory is the traditional term that I grew up with. Bathroom, or rather bathroom, is an American form. Loo has become very much the general middle class term since I was a boy. It's the term I now use as an adult, normally loo. Toilet is a general term, but it has a slight feeling of being not so posh as the others. Kazi is, I think, army slang, probably. It's quite widely known, but it's not the kind of thing educated people use among themselves. Allegedly, its origin is not some Arabic or Indian language, which is what it looks like. Its etymology is supposed to be Italian, via lingua franca from the Middle Ages, which left a kind of successor in the slang of carnivals and fairgrounds, and that's where casa, the small house, kazi, is supposed to come from. Cockney is actually famous, amongst other things, for its vocabulary. But the problem of drawing a line is always very acute. I've listed on the handout examples of London usages which struck me when I first came to live in London, because I do indeed come from the north of England. I didn't grow up in London. I didn't come to London until I was an adult, so by then I was able to be aware of vocabulary differences. The area in front of a London house is for those houses that have steps down to a basement at the front, as many houses in old London squares do. At the foot of those stairs, in front of the house, there's a small courtyard, which is known as the area. It's an architectural feature you don't get in other parts of the country, so not surprisingly, that's just a local name for it. Who collects what the Americans call the garbage, the trash, what we call the rubbish? Well, in London it's a dustman, though in other parts of the country it's a binman. There are other names as well. Bread, a loaf of bread, a long, thin loaf of bread. Well, not very long and thin, not a French-style one, but so long, fairly fat, what do we call that? Different names in different parts of the country. In London it's called a bloomer. Those are just examples then of local vocabulary. More famous is Cockney rhyming slang. You probably know some of these, and you can probably think of many other examples. Supposing I want you to think about something, I might tell you to use your head. Use your brain, use your head. But in London, instead of saying use your head, you can say use your loaf. Why? Because loaf of bread rhymes with head. So rhyming slang, instead of saying head, you say loaf of bread. But you then forget about saying bread and just say loaf. And that's this rather complicated convention of rhyming slang. Use your loaf. Similarly, I think it's now obsolete, but at least within living memory, people used to wear hats, but they in London could call them titfers. Put on a titfer. Why? Because of the expression tit for tat, which rhymes with hat. Oh dear. I was just showing one of you a new dictionary that's come out, just published this week, the Longman Idioms Dictionary. I think it's rather good, actually. I was looking at it, I'm rather pleasantly impressed, my first impression of it. But I have found in it various words that are actually Cockney rhyming slang. For example, to rabbit. Who knows to rabbit? To go rabbiting on about something. Well, to rabbit on about something is to talk, to go on chattering. Why? Apparently because the cheap meats you would typically buy at the butcher's would be rabbit and pork. And pork rhymes with talk. At least in British English it does. Of course, it doesn't for Americans who say pork and talk, but it does for us. Pork and talk, and so rabbit and pork rhymes with talk, and so rabbit means talk. I should cocoa means I don't know. Okay, well that's just fun. Examples of Cockney grammar. This is non-standard grammar then, which defines our non-standard form of English, but many of these things are found all over the country. They're not really specifically London or even southeastern things. The first of these is what's known as multiple negation. We have various words in English that have a positive form and a negative form, or rather an assertive form and a non-assertive form. So we have some and any, something, anything. We have ever and never. The general rule in standard English is that once you've got one negative, all the rest have to be positive or assertive. So standard form is I haven't done anything. The non-standard form is to make everything agree in being negative, and therefore say I haven't done nothing, nowhere, never, not at all. And this is known as negative concord or multiple negation. And it's considered non-standard, though of course there are many languages in which it is standard, but not in English. So I ain't never done nothing means I haven't ever done anything. Verb morphology. Standard English verbs have usually 5 forms, but 2 of them are likely to be irregular. In irregular verbs, the past tense and the past participle. So we've got see, saw, seen, go, went, gone. In non-standard English, very often you have only 2 instead of 3 distinct forms here. And you have the same form for the past tense as for the past participle. So in many non-standard forms of English, seen is the simple past. You've seen him, where in standard English it would be you saw him. Similarly, you get I have. Well, you can get it either way around. You can get seen for saw, or you can get saw for seen. I ain't saw for I haven't seen as well. Write, wrote, written. Standard, have you written it? Non-standard, have you wrote it? There's also an interesting negative form used in short answers, where in standard English you have to say, I didn't. You stole my pencil. No, I didn't. Non-standard, I never. Now, it doesn't mean that, in the literal sense of never, I never did it. It's just a way of saying I didn't. I didn't steal it. So you've got this never here. Now, there's an interesting book by Jenny Cheshire about this non-standard grammar, which some of you may have come across. The verb to be is different in its past tense in many parts of the country. In London, it goes I was, you was, he was, we was, you was, they was, all the way through. Where I grew up, it goes I were, you were, he were, we were, they were. It's were all the way through. Other parts it does other things. But it's very susceptible to differences in different places. Reflexive pronouns. He'll hurt himself, standard. Non-standard, he'll hurt himself. If you've got myself, yourself, it seems logical to say his self, but standard English is himself. Many local varieties are logical. What belongs to me is mine. What belongs to you is, well, yours in standard English, but in London, in Cockney, it can be yourn. What belongs to me is mine. What belongs to you is yourn. What belongs to him is his'n. And again, you can see there's a kind of logic in this, but it's non-standard. Demonstratives, this and that. This has a plural of these. that has a plural, those. But in non-standard English, the plural of that is often them. Look at them people. Put them books down on the table. Put those books, them books down on the table. Adjectives and adverbs. In standard English, most adverbs have a special form ending in ly, different from the adjective. In non-standard English, they tend not to have, so you get things like trains are running normal, or standard trains are running normally. That's an example I collected off a blackboard at my local station after there had been disruptions to the rail service. That was the notice they put up to say that everything was back to normal, running normally. Trains are running normal. Football manager congratulating his team, the boys done good. Non-standard past tense of do, and non-standard good instead of well. It means the boys did well, the boys done good. Prepositions in London, you can go down the pub, where in standard English you'd have to go down to the pub, and you can be down the pub, where in standard English you'd be down at the pub. Equally, you can go up someone's nan's, grandmother's, up to her grandmother's, and throw something out the window, standard out of the window. Though I'm beginning to wonder about that because out the window is American as well as British, and I think it's perhaps almost tending to become standard, though it's not, doesn't belong to my English. I don't say it, but I do hear it all over the place. Possessive pronouns, well, something belonging to me is mine, yes. My book. In non-standard English, in many places, you get this me form. Where's me bag? Meaning, where's my bag? And it's difficult to know whether to say this is just an irregular weak form, that my has a weak form me, one way of analysing it, and in unstressed positions, therefore, you get this me for it, or whether we want to say that it's a different form. Because people do tend to write it, they can show it in writing as ME to indicate it, perhaps we need to regard it as a special grammatical difference. Let's move on to pronunciation. The most famous non-standard feature of pronunciation is dropping your H's. Again, you find this nearly everywhere in England, in popular speech, but it's something that educated people learn to avoid. So you call this your and rather than your hand. The animal is an horse rather than a horse. And you greet somebody by saying, in London, how are you? How are you? Rather than how are you? I did wonder whether to do this interactively and teach you to say these things. I decided not to. How are you? Anyhow, if you want to practice it afterwards, you can do it. That's how you greet someone. How are you? We note also the special form of you. Now, you has a weak form y in various kinds of English. We don't teach, at least I don't teach the weak form y to foreign learners because it's a bit dangerous. It tends to be down market, as we say, or else it's very upper class, and it belongs in any case in fairly casual speech. So I think it's safest always to say you, which is always acceptable. And certainly in sentence final position like this, it has very clear social connotations. In middle class English, in received pronunciation, you use you in final position. How are you, if it's unstressed? I'll tell you. Goodbye, see you. Anyhow, this is mainly about H dropping. I think the point is fairly clear. You do get a certain amount of hypercorrect H insertion from people who come from an H dropping background, where, for example, if you're being very careful, you go to the hospital instead of the hospital. Equally, you may feel that it's nicer to go into the office rather than the office. You can see the mechanism. So shall we say, correct manipulation of H and no H is an important sign of education for those who come from a working class background. Okay, next Cockney thing. Next London thing. Is it better with the lights a bit lower? Yeah. Is that too loud? Okay. TH sounds, dental fricatives. Now these, as you know, are rather unusual sounds if we look at the languages of the world as a whole. Okay, you have them in Spanish, European Spanish, you have them in Icelandic, you have them in Welsh, you have them in various languages, but most languages don't have these sounds. Linguists regard them as marked, unusual, and there seems to be a general tendency in languages to avoid marked sounds and for sound changes to move away from them. So, one of the current trends in English, arguably, is movement away from the dental fricatives. In London, this takes the form of fronting them, moving to a labiodental place of articulation, so that the th becomes th, dental fricative becomes labiodental fricative. And rather than thing, we therefore say thing. Do you remember some years ago there was a musical, a Cockney musical called Things Ain't What They Used to Be, spelled F-I-N-G-S, things. Because of course this is a trademark of Cockney pronunciation. It's not standard, although it is spreading so fast that maybe it will become standard. Mouth likewise becomes mouth. Mother becomes mother. And in counting, 33 becomes 33. Now, this is something that we always get with children's speech as well. A 5-year-old child will typically count for you 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, 3. It's always been the case that a few adults continued to do this, and we tended to regard it as a persistent infantilism. Right, they didn't grow out of it. But what seems to now have happened in London, and increasingly has been happening elsewhere in urban Britain, is that people en masse don't grow out of it. And that more and more adults are doing this. I think the truth with Londoners is that most adults have the option of using proper dental fricatives, but they don't always bother to exercise that option. That is to say, they can say 3 if it's important. For example, it might be important if you say, I've got 3 tickets. You might need to know, yes. Does that mean you didn't pay for them? Or you've got 1, 2, 3 of them? So if it was important, you can say 3. But if it's not important, well then maybe don't bother. Talking of which, I realized that in my first lecture, I did, talking about ear training, say that on some days one thing was going to happen, and on other days something else. And I think 1 or 2 people misheard some days as Sundays, and thought I was talking about weekend work. Well, I wasn't. But you see how important it is to be aware of these possible confusions. And they are a thing that, of course, speakers do know about. If misunderstandings arise, that's an important stimulus to make sure that the messages are distinct. And it's a kind of brake that acts upon sound changes. Well, there are things like free tickets that mean that there are real confusions that can arise through TH fronting, but not an awful lot of them. That's what I've fought all my life. Did I think it or fight it? You didn't know, you see, but you'd have to guess from the context if we've got this fronting. We're still, I think, in an intermediate position. Come back in 100 years and it'll be much clearer whether we're going to do this. Meanwhile, people often ask me, is it all right for foreign learners to do this? Because it's, for many people, a lot easier to say think rather than think. And my considered opinion is that it's better to say think than it is to say sink. If the alternative is, I think you are wrong, then no, say I think you're wrong, and nobody will notice, because there are millions of native speakers who do that. Best of all, though, learn to make proper think, I think. Well, we're getting onto the borders between Cockney and Estuary English, where we have to define what we mean. One of the variables in pronunciation that is found virtually throughout the English-speaking world concerns the ing ending. In standard English, standard accents, it's pronounced with a velar nasal, thus running, reading, writing. But in non-standard English pronunciation, it tends to be pronounced with an alveolar nasal, thus running, reading, or reading, and writing, or writing. This is a matter where, again, we do have to be aware of the continuum of possibilities, the spectrum of usage, the range of options. At the bottom there, a little bit faded, sorry about that, is my picture of the situation we have in England. It seems clear that in received pronunciation, this is solidly and always a velar nasal. And that's the only one that is considered correct. On the other hand, it's not the case that most people who don't speak RP always use an alveolar nasal. There's probably a bunch of people down at the bottom who do so pretty consistently. But the sociolinguists have demonstrated that for the vast bulk of the population, in fact, there are both options available. And most people seem to vary between one and the other, depending perhaps on stylistic factors or perhaps just purely at random. That is, sometimes they'll say reading, sometimes they'll say reading. Now, on the one hand, this is good news for, shall we say, people whose first language is Spanish or Japanese, who have problems distinguishing final nasals anyhow. The kinds of people who might address me as John rather than John and not be able to hear the difference means you're not going to be able to be aware of the difference between running and running. And it doesn't matter, perhaps, because it's just a social class difference or just a stylistic difference. On the other hand, remember that this applies only to the ing ending. It doesn't apply to words like string or king, or on the other hand, words like pin or thin, where that's part of the basic stem. It only applies to the suffix. Here's some more. The thing suffix that we have in something, anything, everything, nothing. Now in Cockney you get th fronting. You also get a final voiceless plosive. So Cockney is something, or something, something to tell you. Anything, everything, nothing. Estuary English sometimes has this final voiceless plosive, but I think probably we need to say that Estuary English typically doesn't have th fronting, so we've got estuary forms like something, anything, everything. I do repeatedly hear it from educated people. It is widespread even in the speech of educated people. Isn't it? Tag question formation. In RP, classically it takes the form, isn't it? Ever since Gibson, we've allowed people to omit the first T and say, isn't it? It's certainly found in one style of RP. Interesting, isn't it? Isn't it, isn't it, isn't it, rather than isn't it? Estuary English, well, has certainly glottal stop as a possibility for the final T, so, isn't it? Interesting, isn't it? Glottal stop there, isn't it? And we then start to worry about things like inning. Interesting, isn't it? And it's a problem of delimiting Estuary English and Cockney to say whether init is part of Estuary English. Init is certainly part of Cockney. On the other hand, Cockney has further, definitely Cockney forms like ain't and ain't it, which are sort of overtly ain't but isn't, and therefore overtly stigmatized. So there's a range of possibilities. These are useful things to know about because they're very frequent. They come very, very frequently in spoken English, so you can easily get examples of them, whereas some of the other things are fairly rare. London pronunciation features. L vocalization. I mentioned that briefly at the beginning. Wherever you get a dark L, in London you can get an O instead. So for a bottle, it can be a bottle or a bottle. Shell becomes shell. Bulb becomes bulb. Cold, meaning cold. Pencil, to write with. Pencil, 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 pencil. Yes, just try saying shell. That's easy. Shell, 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 shell. If you know about the history of various languages, you may recognize a very familiar process of L vocalization known from history of French. Latin bellus becomes French beau. Brazilian Portuguese, Brazil becomes Brazil, and so on. So it's a very familiar process from around the world. Glottaling, glottal stops for T, various syllable final positions. The animal then is a rabbit. Can you make a glottal stop? Not using the tongue tip. I just tried. So rabbit, 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 rabbit. And butterfly, 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 butterfly. Kettle, kettle. What do you use a kettle for? To heat water. Water. Printer. Okay. Non-coalescence. Standard in Tuesday. Londoners say Tuesday. 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 And if we got the word reduce, standard reduce, Londoners say reduce. Just like orange juice. Again, perhaps good news for speakers of Spanish. You find it tricky to master some of those distinctions anyhow. Diphthong shifts, well, the most striking examples of diphthong shifts are the I and the owl vowels. RP price, Estuary English perhaps price, I rather than I, and Cockney rounding the vowel price, or I, price. Price. So we've got a range of possibilities there. So again, if I can illustrate with the next set of words, RP, try, high, wide, mine, Estuary English, try, hide, wide, mine, Cockney, Troy, I, wide, mine. And with owl, RP has owl, mouth, Estuary fronting the first element, mouth, mouth. Cockney reduces the diphthongal movement perhaps to a monophthong mouth or just math. Math. So again with those examples, RP mouth, cow, now, loud. Estuary mouth, cow, now, loud. Cockney mouth, cow, now, loud. In the market, the man will offer to sell you a pan of apples. Pound of apples. But those are not the only diphthongs affected. We get this more general shift in London speech, so that A shifts to I, as we've seen, goes to I, oi goes to oi, O goes to ow, as we've seen, goes to ow. And all this moving around, there are similar changes with certain other vowels. It means that the London vowels do sound rather different from the RP vowels, and it may cause confusion at first. We did have one very nice Indian student in the department who was rather upset when he got on a London bus and the conductor called out, "Outside!" He heard him as saying outside and thought he was being told to get off. Outside! But what did the London conductor really say? Outside. 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 Hold tight. Tight. Hold tight. Hold on tight. So it takes a little tuning in if you're in London to get used to the way things are said. Just let's note the last one, 4.2.8, post-glottal schwa deletion. I put this in especially so that you can have the feeling that you're on the cutting edge of research, because this is a sound change possibility which is not yet recorded in any printed document except this handout, as far as I know. Schwa in London English seems to have the option of being deleted when it follows a glottal stop at the end of a word and the next word begins with a consonant. That is, if we have some expression like "you've got to be joking," "you've got to be joking," "gotta be." Now in London, gotta becomes gotta. When you've got "you've got to be joking," that schwa can then disappear, giving "you've got to be joking," "you've got to be joking." If I say the time is 3:15, quarter can become quarter. We've now got glottal stop, schwa, consonant, quarter past. The schwa can go and give you 3:15. 3:15. As far as I can tell, this is a really productive rule. It seems to work. Every example I've come up with, yes, you can do it in Cockney. So I thought you might like to know about it. When I get round to it, I'll write it up and have a little article perhaps about it, unless one of you does that first before I get round to it. Okay, and with that, I say thank you very much. There's some books here you can look at if you're interested.